Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me today is Courtney Stewart. Courtney, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. Been busy, which is a good thing, but yeah, yeah. It, uh,
Yeah.
so you're still working from home, is that right?
Yeah, we were going to go back to in-person sessions June 1st, but they just let us know that we're going to extend it. So now I don't know when we'll be going back. So I'm excited about that though, because I was kind of getting used to this home time. So I don't know how much longer it's going to be, but it's
Well,
been fun.
yeah, no, well, I can imagine. Well, I mean, at least you can work from home, and there are a lot of people who haven't been able to find a way to make that work. So,
Absolutely.
Um, I think so. One of the things there are a couple of things that I want to talk about before we get to the main topic today, because I am very eager to get Garte out here. Although I just realized it says Landon Knoll, and the part of Landon Knoll will
Oh
be
dear.
played by Garte. Yes, I'll get that corrected in a minute. Um, so
Oh
um,
no.
yeah, the Oh wow, there's a lot. So we talked about prior Sweden and how they have better numbers than most other countries when it comes to containing the virus, and that they've been open. However, one of the things that I had mentioned was you can't compare Sweden to other countries because they have socialized healthcare, they have
Hmm.
a huge literacy rate, and a huge level of trust in the government. So when the government says, "Don't go out, don't make sure you're maintaining social distancing," people have a tendency to believe it in Sweden. In the U.S.,
Hmm.
they don't, so we aren't quite capable. Yeah. So when you compare Sweden to other similar countries, which would be the other Scandinavian countries, you get this. This is a graphic of the uh, mortality rates, total number of deaths in Sweden versus the other Scandinavian countries. Now, Sweden did not do a lockdown; the other ones did. So while Sweden's numbers are better than a number of other countries, they are not as good as other similar countries, which would be the other Scandinavian countries. So this was one of those. This graphic just came out a short while ago, and I wanted to make sure that we covered that because I think there's some misunderstandings about, well, hey, Sweden opened up and their numbers are great. Compared to the US, yeah, their numbers are great. Then again, too, in Sweden, if you're sick, you can stay home at 80% of your regular pay. You can't do that in the United
Hmm.
States. So if you're a waitress and you're sick and you need the tips and you're going in. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's apples and oranges. One of the other things that
Right.
I wanted to oh, and it looks like aha, and we connected to the Matt Dillahunty debate too, so I will have to I will have to fix that. Wow.
What?
No, I connected to the
Oh my
wrong. I
gosh.
connected to got the wrong key, so I will fix that. Thank you guys. We will get that. I will be able to fix that momentarily. But thank you for letting us know. Um, this is what I
We
get
are a
for.
grateful work in progress. Grateful work in progress.
One of the other
Uh,
two other pieces of news that I want to cover quickly. We are going to be having a breaking news later today in probably a few hours, maybe around 9 p.m. Eastern. One of the problems is that uh, or something big that has just happened. Mike Pompeo has come out and said that Hong Kong actually belongs to China. And this is relevant because there have been a lot of protests in Hong Kong. Hong Kong wants to stay its own separate province. It wants to be treated differently. It has been treated differently. We can trade to them at a higher level without the U.S. classified weapons ban. What that means is, for example, we can't send anything to Hong Kong that could be used as a weapon. We cannot send anything to Hong Kong like the high-end supercomputers, or sorry, I shouldn't say to Hong Kong. I mean to China, like high-end supercomputers, any technology that's really high-end. We can do that to Hong Kong because it's been considered its own province, and it's kind of part China, part not. But at this point, it looks like they're in danger of losing that status, and the U.S. is at this point now, it looks like going to be largely responsible for them losing that status. They've been asking the U.S. for help in being recognized as independent and maintaining that recognition, and it looks like that is being eroded. And then the last thing I'm gonna hit. So we're gonna do a breaking news segment on that. And then actually two other quick things. Donald Trump's tweets are now coming with a disclaimer being added to them by Twitter. Twitter is now going to say that the reliability of his tweets and everything coming out of that account is in question, and they will be
Oh,
linking to. Yes, this is a first. Twitter. This is a first for Twitter. So, Donald Trump has now suggested that he may be help closing social media in general because it's being weaponized. Just for
what?
yeah,
Okay,
we're
I'm
gonna.
sorry. I'm sorry, viewers, if that was loud.
No, that was the
Oh my
appropriate.
goodness.
That was totally the appropriate. That was absolutely 100% the appropriate. I stand behind that. What? If you want to do that again, you can go right ahead because that is absolutely the appropriate response. They will be
Oh
fact
my
checking.
gosh.
Yeah. So they're fact checking his articles. He's pissed, and he is. So it looks like, yeah, yep. There's going to be
Okay. Well, but what? Like, okay, so the Twitter, I can see where like he would have, badmouthed Twitter and he's like, oh, it's a liberal Twitter, just like the liberal media, blah, blah, blah. Fine. But like, what? Like shutting down social media, does he realize like all the shit that gets done in the world because of social media as a tool, like especially in other
yeah.
countries? And, there's a lot of access to things that people have because of social media. Yes, it can be accessible. Yes, it can be dangerous and, and be, like echo chambers and misinformation. It can be that. But I think Twitter stepping up and saying, hey, people are being swayed by this, people are being harmed by misinformation, especially around coronavirus. We have to take a stand here. And I really appreciate that about them. But I think it's also like, it's insane to me how Trump could not understand the inherent value. There's dangers to social media, but there's an inherent value to social media.
Well, he may or may not understand it. I mean, he's been prone to hyperbole, and just because he says he can't even shut it down. I mean, there are things he could try to do to. I mean, this is just him. I think saber rattling. I don't think he actually has any ability to. I don't know. I don't know
It
what
just
he's.
worries me with that whole net neutrality thing that we went through recently, and then like I don't know. He might have a lot more power through lobbying and things than we would like to think.
I think he's going to have a hard time shutting it down, but we'll see. We'll see. At any rate, I think he's just upset because he doesn't like them calling him out on it. But and then the last and final thing before we bring out our guest is that Chile is now joining a number of states, including Argentina and China, in admitting that what they've been doing is taking the COVID deaths and marking them as, quote, recovered from COVID-19 instead of deceased from COVID-19. The grounds for that they've argued it. Yeah. This is another. You could do what again? Because that's a completely appropriate.
What?
Exact. Yes.
God. This is going to be my little trademark on the show, isn't it? Like,
I think so.
Like pulling my hair out. Like, what? All right, go ahead.
Oh, well, so what they're saying is that because these people have ostensibly are no longer contagious because they are dead, they are, quote, recovered, and that they are taking the recovered numbers to mean, yeah.
Well, they are. That's true. They're no longer contagious when they're alive, not for very long. Which is something that people wouldn't maybe realize, like that dead bodies of people who have died from COVID-19, you can't really, because they're not alive, they're not able to like pass it.
Yeah, but it's still, they're not recovered, and I think that's one of the problems is that people have been concerned about is what does this do to our understanding of what the actual mortality rates are, because they have been listing people as recovered who in fact are not, or who are deceased. So we're going to be covering that probably as well tonight. So once again, ProLib and I are going to be on tonight. Yeah, I don't know exactly when. We have to figure out when works to discuss, in principle, the issue with Hong Kong and China, because that's a biggie. But we will probably also mention some of these other things. But that's what's been going on. So, yep.
Just real quick, what's so dangerous? And I'm sure everybody knows this already. But like, what's so dangerous about a government who wants to pretend like they're doing things really well, and then they want to lie about how things are actually going? it's completely self-serving, and it's completely, you know, dismissive of what the public actually needs. It's going completely against being a public representative and trying to govern and be a servant of the people. You are serving yourself through, you know, making things seem like they're better than they are, and then parading yourself around as a successful government, and like, you know, people should reelect you and love you. You know, this is just the epitome of this like current administration. It's like, you know,
Well,
just making up these crazy ideas, and then making everybody blaming other people for their own mistakes, and just like, oh, we're gonna come out on top, and the main goal is to get reelected. The main goal is not to come out of COVID-19 better than we could.
yeah, well, and of course, too, the Trump administration has said that the fact that the numbers are so high in the United States is actually a plus, because what that means is that we have caught up in testing, and the numbers are high because we're accurately testing people. That's not true. We haven't
Okay.
caught up in testing. We are well behind on testing. The numbers are so high because the numbers are high, and because we've been doing. I mean, the U.S. is 4% of the population. 4% of the world's population lives in the U.S. 29%. That's 30% of the world's COVID cases are in the U.S., and we are testing less than most other countries. So the numbers are probably higher than that. Saying that, well, gee, you know, they must be, because no, he's making that up, which I know is going to come as a shock to a great many people, but he's completely making that up. So we'll discuss that. We'll discuss that and more. So I hope you guys will join us. Like I said, I wish we had a time. We may be shooting actually for 9 p.m. depending.
I don't have time to get on my soapbox about that. So we're just gonna,
well, yeah.
we're gonna zip and get to the topic. No.
Yep. So before we go
can't.
forward, I do want to apologize. So we're going to have Matt Dillahunty on in a couple of weeks. But the thumbnail is already up, and I accidentally connected to the wrong show. Yeah, that's good. Thank Courtney for that one. So thank you, Courtney. So we're going to have Matt Dillahunty on, but I accidentally connected to that stream instead of the Garte stream. So I've already updated the settings. A refresh in the browser should show the correct stream, and I'll start updating some of the links once we get Dr. Garte out here. But today we have on Dr. Garte to discuss. We discuss a lot of deconversion stories, and I thought it would be nice to try to get a few conversion stories to understand the other side and give that equal time. And Dr. Garte is a friend of the show. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Garte. Dr. Garte, how are you? And he may be muted there, so we'll have to have him unmute himself, because no worries. Hey.
Hi.
How are you, good sir?
I'm well, and I'm wearing this mask simply to make a point, which is that we should be wearing masks whenever it's appropriate. This is not appropriate. At least I thought it wasn't appropriate until I heard the plan that you just mentioned. And so I'm wearing this mask also in support of our president, who is against social media. And so I will say nothing, because since I'm against social media, I will say nothing on this show.
Whoa! Don't take it out on us. What
Oh my
Okay,
normally I'm the one.
Has been made.
People are trying to get me to shut up. Like, wait, can you get Nick to say nothing on the show? It's just, all of a sudden, tonight, Nick Soutter doesn't say a thing. Our numbers are just going to go.
That was a feeble attempt at sarcasm, but I found of all the things you mentioned about news, the idea that Trump would shut down social media is really, that's one of the best. That would, I can't even begin to discuss that one. So
and just claim that he can too. Like,
I don't think he can. But the interesting thing is that if he actually was able to and did, that wouldn't do a lot of good for him and his friends.
That was a thought that crossed my mind. It might almost be worth, if let's just say for just the rest of the election cycle.
Might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That's an interesting philosophical discussion.
Anyway.
All right. Well, so if I recall, it's been a while since I've looked at the numbers, but if I recall, of all the switches, either from theist to atheist or atheist to theist, less than 12% of atheists actually end up becoming religious. So it is harder to find. It is harder to find conversion stories. So thank you very much for sharing us. Now, have you? Could you tell us a little bit just about? I know you've written a book about it. Could you tell us a little bit about the book and tell us a bit about what you do? And I mean, I know our regular viewers are already pretty familiar with you, but
there's the book. It was published by Kriegel Press in November of 2019. The title is The Works of His Hands. The subtitle is A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. And it has a foreword by a well-known British theologian named Alistair McGrath. The rest, to tell you about the book, it's basically my story of my conversion, which started from a position of initial atheism and then changed very gradually and very slowly. I wasn't actually baptized as a Christian until I was 65, which is
oh wow,
a few years ago. Yeah. I came to Christ a bit before that, but I kept it quiet, and it was just a very personal change, and very few people knew about it. But then I eventually went public and was baptized, joined a church, and now I'm very active, both in my church and particularly in the whole area of faith and religion. And I'm involved in a number of organizations, and I'm the editor-in-chief of a magazine called God and Nature that's put out by the American Scientific Affiliation, which is the largest and oldest organization of Christians who work in the sciences in the US and Canada. There's about 3,000 to 4,000 members. I don't remember the exact number. And that's a quarterly magazine, which is, as I said, is called God and Nature. If you look at my Twitter feed, you can see a link to it on my profile. So, and I'm doing other things as well in terms of the whole issue of Christianity and Christian faith. I recently had a testimony article in Christianity Today, which got a lot of attention. And that's where I am at the moment.
Can I ask, in terms of your deconversion, if we might be able to start with what made you an atheist and how you defined that? Because I think sometimes we have people who start with atheism and then go to Christianity, but sometimes that is more of a transition from a general Christianity to a more specific one, or it's not really atheism.
Right.
And I do want to preface that by saying that everyone uses the label as they see fit, and I think that there are universal acceptance of certain terms, but if you self-identify as an atheist, I don't think anybody can say you were wrong about that. But it just, people mean different things when they say that sometimes.
Absolutely, and a lot of people have asked me that, and so I'll make it very clear, and it's in my book, and I've posted about it many times. I grew up in a family that were former members of the American Communist Party. My parents had been members, and they were very strong atheists, to the point of being what we would now call militant or new atheists. They not only didn't believe in God, they believed that God was an impossibility. Christianity was the root of all historical evil. Was nothing about their views that differed in any way, except perhaps being more extreme than those of Victor Stenger or Richard Dawkins or anyone else you want to mention who's a modern atheist. And it wasn't just them. My entire extended family, which had roots as Russian Jews, but going back all the generations, including my grandparents, were all communists, either members of the party or associated, and atheists. So I knew no religious people of any kind growing up. Everybody I knew in my family and a large number of friends who were the children of my parents' friends were also what we used to call red diaper babies. In other words, the children of ex-communists. And there is a very strong connection between communism and atheism. That's been debated occasionally, but certainly in the American communist community, atheism was as it was in Russia, a very strong correlation. So there's no question that I started out as an actual, real, bona fide atheist. That's one of the reasons it took me so long to actually convert, because there were many times during my life when I was considering the idea of some religion, and I just always backed away. And, I mean, it was my early training. And part of that was also, a belief in science, materialism, philosophical naturalism, all the things that go with a Marxist atheist viewpoint.
So growing up, were your parents specifically, would you say anti-theist? It sounds like you're
totally
saying, okay, so they were very much against religion.
Absolutely.
Was so as let's say as a child to your teenage years, was that something you embraced? Did you think they were going too far? Were you sort of following in their footsteps? How did that work for you?
Oh yeah, now as a young child. I grew up in the 50s. They couldn't tell me they were communists. They would have been arrested. So I didn't know that they had actually been communists till much later. But I absorbed the worldview, and I was also absorbed the need for secrecy and being somewhat discreet, because it was a very dangerous time to be a leftist. Never mind a member of the party, although they were not members by the time I was around, but they had been previous members. So I follow in their footsteps? Yes. I was a radical in college for most of my college career. I was very active in the civil rights movement. I was very active in the anti-war movement later, but that was somewhat different. I always considered myself politically left. That eventually changed due to some circumstances, which I don't need to get into. But I still consider myself now as a liberal, but I'm not in any way, shape, or form either a communist or a strong leftist. And, that's. But I would say that it took me a long time before I began to see the cracks in the wall of truth that was presented to me as communism. My mother never, her whole life, got out of it. She was supporting the Soviet Union in the invasion of Czechoslovakia. There was nothing the Soviet Union could do that was wrong. And she did not live to see the end of the Soviet Union. She died about a year or so before that. But I don't know how that would have affected her if she had. She would have been completely crushed.
So, Nick, do we have time for him to clarify for me, like, how communism was connected to atheism to him? Because I don't know much about communism, but I've never heard a connection between the two.
Sure.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Wow. All right. Where do I start? So I guess it started with Marx, who was also very anti-religious. And I think what the main key is here is that the communists in Russia and eventually everywhere in the world, with some exceptions, such as South America, which is an exceptional case, but everywhere else, especially, for example, during the Spanish Civil War, the communists saw Christianity as a rival movement. They saw religion as, the opium of the people, as Marx put it. And in Russia, religion was very powerful. The Russian Orthodox Church was very strong. and it was a competition, and it was made to be associated with the West, with imperialism. And when Stalin took over, I mean, the churches were closed, purged. In Spain during the Civil War, the communists really actually massacred priests.
Well, and so did Stalin. I mean,
Stalin did too for a while. The only time that Stalin let up on the Orthodox faith during his rule was during World War II. At that point, he began to allow churches to open because it was demanded, it was necessary, because the people never really lost their faith. It just went underground. And, Russia was not in a good situation in World War II for most of it. And he needed to increase morale. And it was the only way to do that was to open up the churches. But once that was over, he cracked down again. And everywhere in the world, communists have opposed, again, with some exceptions, have been very opposed to religion, to especially to Christianity, because that was the religion that was, prevalent in countries where communists were. The Chinese government today is very anti-religious, and they're oppressing both Muslims and Christians wherever that's happening, and it's happening a lot in China. And again, I think for the same reason, it's a competition. Communism is a worldview. It's an all-encompassing worldview. And the irony of all this, and this irony is shown by the exceptions, for example, in South America, where you have what's called liberation Christianity. The irony is that the message of Jesus Christ and the message of communism are not that different. They both say that all people are worthy of dignity and justice, and that they're both against the idea of class systems and things of that sort. So in South America, you have this have always been a strong movement of very left-wing priests who are preaching Christianity from a point of view that almost sounds Marxist. But again, that's an exception. And that's why I think that the historical hatred of God, religion, etc., among Western communists in the U.S., in Europe, in Russia, in China, even is not because of necessarily ideology so much as a question of competition. And of course, also, I should also say that historically, it's also true that Christian churches going back in Europe up until 1300 were generally supportive of the ruling class, of whether it was the monarchy or later of established society. So they were a conservative influence in Europe. And of course, the communists were not conservative at all. They were trying to change society. So the church was in the way. So there are a lot of historical reasons, but there's no question that was true. And I grew up in an anti-religious family that was. I was Jewish, although I didn't even know what that meant. I had never been in a synagogue. I had never been to Hebrew school. I actually knew very few other Jews where I grew up in Brooklyn. And I didn't know what that even meant. And, I was certainly not told anything by either my parents or even my grandparents, who were originally from the old country. So it wasn't just Christianity, it was religion in general. Any sense of religion was out. I mean, we didn't celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah. What my family celebrated, we gave presents on New Year's Day. Now, you probably don't know this, but New Year's Day is when Soviet children got presents in Russia.
Wow.
Since the revolution. So that was the holiday to get presents. So it was a very strong form of anti-religion.
Okay. Yeah. So what's interesting about that though is the kind of overarching presence of ideology of some kind, whether it's religious ideology or political ideology. And so I think atheism on its own can sometimes be latched onto, the different political ideologies like Nazism or like Stalin.
Right.
And so sometimes, if atheists had their way, then this is the world we would live in. And it's very, very different from the modern, and I think probably even a lot of atheist thinkers that go back a very long time. If you read Christopher Hitchens' book on essential readings for the Portable Atheist, essential readings for an atheist. It goes through the very long kind of questioning of religious thought and questioning of religious ideologies and political ideologies. And so
Right.
I think from what my understanding of atheism that I adopt isn't tied to a political ideology. It's more like secular humanism, and it's more, it is a love of science, but it's not in competition with religion. It is in opposition to some of the harms of religion, but it's not in opposition to religion as a whole. Not, at least not for me, but yeah, so that's interesting. I wonder if you knew people as you grew up who were atheists, but their atheism wasn't tied to a communist ideology.
Yeah, well, let me answer that quick, but I also want to go back to what you said, because I think that's very important, and I agree with it. I agree with a lot of it. No, everyone I knew growing up was Catholic. They were Irish and Italian Catholics, kids who, this is an area of Brooklyn that happened to be fairly diverse. There were a few Jews, but Brooklyn and New York in general is basically Irish, Italian, and Jewish. There's some other groups too, but I was mostly in that crowd, and they were all Catholic. They all went to church. I wouldn't say they were terribly religious. It was a little bit of a more of a rough neighborhood than one usually encounters. So I didn't meet anyone who else was an atheist, except for the children of the friends of my parents. And that was mostly in school. Well, not even in school. It was just I went to a communist camp, for example. So I met other kids who had grown up the same way as I did in the camp. But they had the same, I didn't meet any of the pure atheists that you were talking about. I'm not sure that they existed at that time, because there were very few atheists around in general. There were some. There were a few, but
they were kind of underground, but yeah.
They were either underground or they were very well known and writing, like O'Hare. I mean, I can't remember all the names, but there were a few, unusual intellectuals who were just atheists, and they were not necessarily political. But I do agree with you that let's call it the pure definition. Sometimes it's called the weak atheism, which is that you just don't believe in God. You're not anti-theist. You're not claiming that God does not exist, right? But you're saying you don't believe in it. I think that viewpoint is a non-religious, non-political viewpoint. That's a philosophical one, and that does exist. I know people who feel that way. But you also are correct that it's extremely easy to attach atheism to any political or religious ideology. And I often say that my first religion was actually communism, because although it's not a religion, it shares some of the same qualities, some of the negative qualities of some religions, which is that, it's dogmatic. You have
dogmatic ideology. Yeah,
exactly. And, it has its own saints, and it has its own, you can be excommunicated from the Communist Party just from a church. Yeah. So, in a way, it was sort of semi-religious, and I didn't like that. It was one of the first things that drove me away. And there were several things that drove me away, which we'll get to. But I agree that it's kind of hard to maintain that purity of atheistic thought. And I think it's even getting difficult now because if you look at aside from Hitchens, if you look at people like Sam Harris and a few of the others, they're attaching a lot of other stuff to atheism, and it could, and there are different ways that different people attach it. And I think we all know about the huge atheist splits that are going on all over the place, and the big one is political, right? I mean, it's atheism plus, which is that atheism should be a progressive social justice movement, and those who say no, it shouldn't be. I can be right wing and be an atheist. I can be libertarian and be an atheist. And these battles within the atheist community, as you all know, resulted in the cancellation of the last atheist conference, right? I mean, these are serious splits. So it's a danger, I think. Not that I'm opposed to any of these particular political views, but if you want to keep atheism as a pure philosophical belief that one does not believe in supernatural or in anything like a god, you have to be very careful, because it's very quick. I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in is the way science gets pulled into atheism. Okay, and I'm very strong proponent of the idea that science is a-religious, apolitical, a-philosophical. Okay, so even though you might feel that science is, or should be, that science should be, in opposition to religion, you may, I agree with that as you're doing science, but it should also be in opposition to a denial of religion. In other words, if science has nothing to do with the existence of God, it also has nothing to do with the non-existence of God. And unfortunately,
I'm not sure that would be true.
Well, we can discuss it. But
let's save that discussion for later. Please finish, and then I have a question I wanted to.
Yeah, what I can see happening a lot is the idea that, well, I'm an atheist, so therefore this particular scientific statement can't be true, and this other one probably is. And I don't like that, just as I don't like it when a young earth creationist says, well, I don't believe in the science that denies the fact that the earth is 6 days, that denies the facts of the Bible. Okay. I don't go with that, and I don't go with the opposite view either. So that's where I stand on this whole issue of mixing atheism with other things.
So now you had said earlier that you started to lose your belief in sorry, what is it?
Communism.
Thank you, communism. And so you said that it sounds like before you started to lose your or started to become a believer, before you started to lose your atheism. So
way before, right?
So how did that happen, and how did that tie into, assuming it did, into your sort of eventual erosion of atheism?
Okay, so that's a fascinating question, because the answer completely parallels what I've heard from Christians who have deconverted. Okay, why did you deconvert? Why did you leave the church? And what you will often hear, and I know a lot of these people. I mean, you know them too, who were originally Christians and then deconverted. And a lot of what they will say is hypocrisy. Okay, so the church was saying something and they weren't living it, or they were saying one thing and then they were saying the opposite, or their behavior was not in consonant with what they were claiming they believed. And that's exactly what happened to me in several ways. I found that people who presented themselves as being progressive, left-wing, liberal, highly left-wing, whatever, that they were, when they weren't spouting the line, the line of the Communist Party at the time, they were doing things that weren't in consonance with that general idea. I mean, what I what I had been raised with, and this came from for example, from my grandfather, who had been a working man and was, starving in Russia, and he was a communist because he thought that was the only way that people could have dignity and respect. And I didn't see that portrayal of dignity and respect in the way these people treated other people. I'll give you a couple of examples. One thing that really confused me, for example, at my communist camp, is we used to sing Negro spirituals, right? And what are the Negro and the reason was obviously to be in step with and support of, Black aspirations, African American aspirations, which at that time were just starting to be made known. But what struck me as strange was that all the lyrics were about, go tell it on the mountain, Jesus Christ is born, and give you that old time religion. I mean, all the spirituals were exactly that. They were about Jesus Christ. They were about God. And I remember asking a number of adults, why is that? Why do we have to have these horrible verses about God and Jesus in these songs? And they were answers. They were very interesting answers as well. The blacks were slaves, and they were not well educated, and they were very poor, and they were fooled into believing in Christianity. And the more I heard these answers, the more what I actually heard was, they're not really very smart. They got fooled because they're easily fooled. Now, they didn't actually use those words, but that was the impression I got. And I knew that wasn't true because I knew Black kids, and I knew, I worked with Black teenagers. I had a job where I was working with a bunch of Black teenagers, and I knew Black kids, and I didn't see anything dumb about anybody. But this was the older generation seemed to have this idea that they were, basically racism, which of course didn't go that. Talk about hypocrisy, right? Here you have these communists who are, all in favor of African American liberation, and we're basically looking down their noses at them at the same time. And there were other incidents that occurred, which are too long to go into, which were just completely hypocritical. And then later, of course, I when I read history, and I read a lot of history, I don't know if you guys know about this, but in 1939, the Communist Party was incredibly anti-Nazi, anti-German, anti-fascist. And then the Hitler-Stalin Pact came about, and all of a sudden, overnight, and I have the New York Times articles to show this, the next day, the Communist Party dropped all of its Nazi and anti-Nazi rhetoric and became a peace party. And the enemy was no longer Germany, it was England, because England was looking for war, wanted America to get in the war. And the American Communist Party actually became allied with the isolationists, who were very right-wing, to prevent the U.S. from getting into the war. And that went on for 2 years until June 22nd, 1941, when, guess what happened? Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Right back, the next day, the American Communist Party put out flyers saying, all unite against Nazi fascist Germany. It's time to back up our Soviet allies. So,
Interesting.
The Communist Party has been a joke in terms of integrity and honesty forever. I mean, ever since Stalin took over, at least. And there are many other examples of this. Whatever is in their best interest, they do. Whatever it takes. There's no pretense even of trying to hold to a standard of moral or ethical or even political values. And I mentioned the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that was just another example. But by then I was long gone. But I began to see this hypocrisy early, and I began to and not just me, my whole generation began to see that. And there were almost no members of my generation who joined the Communist Party. The radicals joined what was called the New Left. We joined things like Students for Democratic Society, SDS. We joined other organizations. But the Communist Party fell into huge disfavor because of this, because it was just seen as a hypocritical, nonsensical viewpoint. So I left. I was out of anything related to communism or even something close to it by my early 20s.
And so when did you start questioning your atheism?
So that came later. And the thing that caused me to question my atheism was actually science. Now, what happened, and this is disgusting, there's very little about what I just said that's in my book, but what I'm about to say is the basis of the first half of my book, actually. And what happened was I started learning. I got after being disillusioned with politics, I went heavily into science, and I went to graduate school in biochemistry. I had been a chemistry major in college. And I started not only learning what I had to learn as a biochemist, but I was also reading a lot just of science, books about science. And what I was learning about physics, for example, was shocking. I had learned philosophical materialism, which is the philosophy that holds that science can answer all questions, that really you need logic and reason and rationality to understand the world, and this will explain everything. And although I had learned about quantum mechanics as an undergrad, and I had solved the Schrodinger equation, and it was one of my exams, I didn't really understand what quantum mechanics was saying until I read a few books about it. And quantum mechanics basically says, no, that's wrong. The world is not what you think it is. It's not predictable. You can know as much as you want to know about any system, and that won't let you predict how it's going to behave in the future. At least a quantum system, not a Newtonian system. But that's the basis of how atoms and electrons and light function. They function according to quantum mechanics, not according to classical mechanics. And so at the very basis of the universe, the smallest particles act in a way that's completely counterintuitive, that is not what we observe, what we think we see. We can't predict anything because ultimately the wave equation is probabilistic. It's not deterministic. And I was thinking, wait a minute, whoa, so philosophical materialism doesn't work. And I started wondering, what does that mean for my worldview? Now, it didn't turn me away from science. Quantum mechanics is scientifically valid. The equations are great. But it did make me think harder about, what's going on in this universe of ours. Before I stop saying anything about this, I'll just say one more thing about the Schrodinger equation, which I mentioned. The Schrodinger equation is basically I'm quoting now from a book I'm reading by Sean Carroll, who's a very famous atheist and also a very good physicist. And he says in his book, it's called Something Deeply Hidden. He says basically the same thing I'm saying about quantum mechanics, is that it's something that's really philosophically very difficult to understand. And he mentions that the wave equation, the Schrodinger wave equation, is basically the basis of the entire universe, because it's the way we understand electrons and atoms and particles and molecules and everything. And the wave equation is very interesting, and it relates to something I saw on Twitter a while ago, and I've seen it spread around, which is a meme put out, I think it was originally by Atheist Republic, which is God equals the square root of -1. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have.
So the square root of -1, which is abbreviated as little I, is an imaginary number. Unfortunately, the atheists who put this out are not physicists, and they don't understand that imaginary numbers are real. I mean, they're not in your mind. They actually exist.
Yeah, they have.
And
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
and the
What
first,
You said atheists put out something?
Well, no,
yeah, this is a meme.
it's a common atheist meme, which is intended to suggest that God isn't real because
God is
God
imaginary.
God
Right.
equals the square root of -1, which cannot be represented in a real sense.
Right.
So it's represented by the variable lowercase I for imaginary. It's an
Right.
imaginary number, even though we have to deal with
Okay.
it in mathematics.
Right.
And it is the first term in the Schrodinger equation. So my comment when I see that is, yes, God is the square root of -1.
So
It holds the entire universe.
it's a sort of almost a backfire. I'm trying to think of
It's a backfire.
Yeah.
It's a backfire.
So now, how did? So I guess I have two questions, and we can, however we want to get to them. So the first question is, what influence? Well, no, actually, I'm sorry. The first question is, so if you started to believe at least in a higher power, that would at a minimum be deism. But you got from deism specifically to Christianity. So my first question would be, what was it that brought you specifically to the conclusion that Jesus was real? And then secondly, once you did reach that conclusion, and once you sort of felt comfortable in that, you eventually got baptized, you started to move forward with it. Were there any consequences for you? I don't know if your parents were still alive at that point. Did you have to come out to them? What was that? And your friends, the scientific community, and a little bit. So just to sort of prep where we're headed with that. So
Okay. So I'm going to skip ahead because it took me a long time to get to the point of even believing that there could be a God. And I'm not going to go into all of that because that'll take a lot of time. And I'll go right to your question. Once I actually did begin to think that there might be a God, and this was like 20 years later after I began. I mean, what I like to say is what science did was make me an agnostic. I began to think I don't have the answers. It's not all science. There's a lot out there that science doesn't answer. So that made me an agnostic. It did not make me a believer at all. The believing thing took a lot more time. And as I said, I'll hurry through that. And your question was, how did I get to go to Christianity? And the answer is I tried a lot of things. Once I began thinking that spirituality was real, that there might be something beyond the physical reality that we know of and can test and can measure scientifically, I started thinking about spirituality, and I did all kinds of things. I tried transcendental meditation. I was interested in biofeedback. I looked into Buddhism, which I thought was a nice non-theistic religion. I didn't know. I was searching, and I spent a lot of time. And by the way, a lot of this is similar to what Aaron Ra went through. We had a discussion where he told me about his searching period, where he was looking at all kinds of new agey type stuff, and he rejected it, and I did too. But he rejected it and went right to atheism. I rejected it, didn't go back to atheism, but kept looking. And eventually, the last thing I thought I would ever do would become a Christian, because I had been really inoculated with anti-Christianity a lot. And I had a lot of views that I later found out were not accurate, both historical and theological. I didn't know really what Christianity was all about. And I met some Christians, one in particular, who asked me to go to church with her, and I did. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. I was terrified. I'd never been in a church in my life. I was in my 40s here. And I thought I was going to get, yelled at and stoned, and people were going to point at me and yell at me, and that wasn't what happened. It was very nice, actually, and I was really surprised. So that didn't make me a Christian, of course, but it began to knock down some of my resistance, and I started thinking about it, and I began reading the Gospels. And I guess it's a little bit too much to go into all of it, but eventually I really liked the story of Jesus Christ as God coming to earth. I liked it. I didn't believe it, but I liked it because, you know, that's nice. And I liked what he said. I liked his message. I didn't believe in the resurrection. I didn't believe in all the, you know, the mythical stuff, which I thought of as mythical. But I liked the idea of it. And then now comes the hard part. What happened? And what happened, and I'm not going to go into details, but it's in the book. I began getting actual calls from God, from the Holy Spirit. And I realized that I'd had them. Later, I realized I'd been having these all my life, and I had just simply put them away. Maybe I'm a very spiritual person, and I was very open to it. But I had denied it. And then at a certain point, I began having dreams and other experiences that were just very strong. And finally, one day, I had an experience where I believe firmly that I was basically taken by the Holy Spirit and shown the truth of Jesus Christ. And that converted me right there on the spot. And it was a very strong experience. It was I can't prove it. It's not scientific, but I cannot deny it to myself. And that's who counts when it comes to this. So that experience led me to say, I'm a Christian, but first of all, I was not very sure of myself. I still had a lot of doubts. I thought the whole thing was crazy. I didn't tell anybody. Nobody knew. And I certainly didn't tell my colleagues or my friends at work. At that time, I was a professor. And I didn't know what to do with it. And I literally thought, and this is true, I thought I was the only scientist who had ever come to believe in Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And then I saw a book called The Language of God by Francis Collins, which I read. And that opened my eyes to, and as I've said publicly a couple of times, now I knew there were two of us, me and Francis Collins. But that was a surprise to me. And then I began looking into it, and I saw that, in fact, Louis Pasteur and Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell and Lord Kelvin and on and on. I mean, Robert Boyle, all the early astronomers were all Christians, and not just because everybody else was a Christian, but they actually wrote books about being Christian and how important it was. So, okay, well, that's nice, but that all went away. And then I found out no. And I started doing some research and found there are an awful lot of Christians who are scientists. And so I was not alone. I was not the first one. And then I eventually discovered this organization, the ASA, and I joined it. And that really helped. And that goes to answer your second question, Nick. What was it like when I became Christian?
Although I'll point out, just because I was going to mention Francis Collins earlier when we started, and I neglected to do so. Francis Collins just got was it the Nobel Prize?
No. He got the Templeton Prize.
Oh, okay. So
which is actually pays more than the Nobel, but it's close. He may still get the Nobel Prize, by the way.
And he was actually good friends with Christopher Hitchens, who was a big fan of his.
Yes. Yes. I happen to know Francis. We've met many times. I worked at NIH, and I actually met him the first two times in a purely scientific context. I didn't even realize he was Christian the first time. And the second time, he was 2 levels above me at the NIH. He was the director, and I was a division director in one of the agencies. And then I also met him at various Christian Science venues, meetings, and things. And he's a wonderful guy, terrific man, and one of the most brilliant scientists who's ever lived. I mean, the things he's done, most people don't even know how much he's done in genetics and in human genome studies. It's absolutely brilliant. But then, I met many others. I met one of the Nobel Prize winners who lives not far from where I am, Bill Phillips, who's a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and also a Methodist like me. And I'm not going to waste time going over the lists. There are plenty. Yeah.
I really wish that we had time for me to kind of go back and backtrack a little bit, because there are a lot of things that you've said in here that I think I would either very much disagree with or want to clarify, because it's your characterization of atheism and your characterization of the way that what science has to say about spirituality and religious belief, I think is very different than from my understanding than what
surprised.
You're characterizing of. And so, yeah, well, and I think that's, there are so many people who start with a religious belief because they were raised in it, and then they deconvert based on what they learn in science. And
Right.
And at least from a psychological standpoint, religious faith to me makes sense as a byproduct of our evolution, and as the way that we tend to assign meaning and assign agency to things, and community and all kinds of things that religion provides for people. But I do think that science has a lot to say about what is real and what is not. And when specific religions make specific claims, science can say something about that because it's dealing with the real world, with the natural world. And so science is within the realm of the natural world, but it's not, it doesn't have much to say about a spiritual world, because it doesn't, we can't test a spiritual world. It's not a physical thing. So,
Right.
But when a spiritual world acts on the natural world, that's where science can say something. And so I think that there is a lot we can know from science about religious belief and whether it's a legitimate thing to believe. But again, I think
we can have them back, and we can have that. I think that's a separate discussion. I think that would be interesting, and I'd be thrilled to have it. But so we were talking about what were the consequences for you? So it sounds like initially the consequences were just a deep sense of isolation. You're a scientist. It's reasonably counter to the culture, but as I recall, 70% of all Nobel Prize winners were actually theists of some kind. So I think it's interesting. It seems counter to the culture, but the practice may be slightly different. But so you started to figure out that you weren't alone in this. So were your parents still alive? Did you talk?
No. They had died.
Okay, so what started to be the consequences? So you started to feel alone. It sounds like you might even have a coming out moment coming up here, which I know I laugh just because a lot of atheists have that kind of experience. So
right,
it's just interesting to hear it.
So yes, I did have a coming out moment, and it was let's see, I had already been baptized. I was baptized in 2012. And in 2015, I retired from the NIH. And at my retirement going away party, somebody asked me, I was up at the lectern, and somebody asked me, what am I going to do now? And I said, well, I plan to get more active in my church. And you could have heard a pin drop. I saw about a dozen mouths pop open. And I talked a little bit more about my interest in science and faith. And it was very quiet in the room. This is the NIH, so everybody there was a scientist, more or less. And at the end, about 6 or 7 people came up to me and said, thank you, Dr. Garte. I'm a Christian too, but I haven't told anyone. And that was the first time I said anything publicly, and it was, of course, not the last. I then got on Twitter and social media, and now I'm pretty open, totally open about it. And I am my main goal now is to convince young people especially, and people who are doubting their faith because of science, what Courtney just was talking about, that if you were a young earth creationist and a member of a strongly conservative and evangelical church, and the pastors were horrible and saying terrible things, and you left your faith, I understand that. I mean, I would have too. If I'd been told that you can't be a Christian unless you give up your acceptance of evolution, and you can't be a Christian unless you agree that the earth is 6,000 years old, I never would have gone anywhere near it. But the fact is, you don't have to do that. I didn't have to do that, and no one else has to do that. The majority of Christians in the world accept evolution. The majority, not just a small group. The idea that the earth is 6,000 years old is a sort of a crazy thing that came from one Christian cult called Seventh-day Adventists. I shouldn't call it a cult. It's one Christian denomination that brought this into, and then it spread into the Southern Baptist Convention. And that is the group that, insists that you can't be a real Christian, or they don't even say that. They just insist that you have to agree that the earth is young and that evolution is false. But, I've debated, as you well know, I've debated with people like Kent Hovind about evolution. And I've been on many channels, including this one, but also other atheist channels like Jackson Wheat's channel, talking about evolution. And my goal is to tell people that you're not rejecting science when you accept faith. It's not necessary at all. And look at Francis Collins, the Biologos group, which he founded, have a number of incredibly evangelical and thoughtful Christians, scientists, philosophers, others, who are totally accepting of all of mainstream science. There's no reason not to be. So that's, my mission and the mission of a lot of others of my colleagues and friends. My book came out on November 19th of 2019, published by Kriegel. And the very same day, another book by a friend of mine named Greg Davidson came out by the same publisher on the same day, called Friend of Science, Friend of Faith. And it's different from my book, but, again, he is a geologist, a Christian geologist, and the book is about why real mainstream science is theologically sound for Christians and why young earth creationism is not. So, it's a strong and growing movement among Christians to embrace the idea of scientific reality as we know it. Now, I have to say, Courtney, in response to something you said that science is good because it tells us what's real in the natural world. And that's true to an extent. But I could ask you a question. You're looking at a computer and it's probably on a table or something. And my question is that table solid? Is that computer solid?
Well, I think there's the quantum mechanics answer and there's the practical answer, right?
Right. It feels solid, so we call it solid. But in reality, it's not solid at all.
Well, but it depends on why you're asking the question. Like for the purposes of like what type of object it is in the room, it's more solid than like the lotion on the table, right? So I think
right.
There's a dangerous line that you have to walk between calling into question what is accepted in science and what we know about science and what we don't know, and adding in other things that we don't know, and it almost becomes like a God of the gaps. It becomes It becomes this sense of like,
yeah.
But again, we're not what the topic is, so I'm gonna get off.
Okay.
Of that.
Well, you're all right, and I should probably not pursue it because of the same thing. I just wanted to say that we're not always aware of what we think is real, and science itself is telling us that reality is really strange and really complicated. So right. I just want to make that point, and I think you agree with that, right?
Well, and I think one of the points you were making earlier, if I if I understood correctly, isn't that you're necessarily adding anything per se, but that you think they're not mutually incompatible, and that one can,
Right,
yeah.
right.
So you're not, yeah. So I think that was I don't think you're.
Yeah.
I think you see them as almost what was it? Non-overlapping. Jesus, what it was Francis
Magisteria,
Magisteria. Thank
magisteria.
you. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Which I think
Gould's.
was Francis Collins.
Well, no, no, no. That was from Stephen Jay Gould.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yep. Uh,
So the non overlapping magisteria idea was something I really liked when it first came out, because I was still not quite into Christianity, and I liked but I kind of thought that, this is my agnostic period when I was thinking, well, maybe there's something beyond, and I like the idea, and Gould may have shared some of that. I don't know. I don't think so, but it's possible. Uh, the idea that, there could be two ways of looking at the universe, science and spirituality, and the two are not connected. But as a Christian, I don't believe that. I think that there is a complete uh, they are overlapping, but they're overlapping in a mutually supportive way. So you don't go into a laboratory, do an experiment, and pray first. Okay, that doesn't make any sense unless you want to pray in general. But you don't expect the experiment to work out in a particular way because you prayed about it. You don't bring your religion into the lab, and nobody does, frankly. I don't know anyone who ever has done that. And you don't, you know, I, you don't speak scientifically about what you're learning in church about, spiritual truths. Because I think one of the big dangers in the modern world is scientism, which is a really false belief. And the first person who ever told me it was
mhm,
false was actually my father, who was a strong atheist.
mhm.
And what he said was, you have to understand, because he was a chemist, and what he said was, you have to understand, science cannot answer all questions. Of course, he meant it in a political sense.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
it's true. It's
I'm sorry.
true. I mean, is
Oh,
there? Well, you don't agree, but
I'm sorry. Go
She's
ahead.
gnashing her
that's
teeth. We could.
if
It's,
you
it's,
if
I'm
you
sorry.
don't agree, that's a
I'm
very
sorry.
bad sign, Courtney, because that
Mm,
the idea of
well,
scientism is
I'm
one
having trouble.
of
I'm having trouble
the
now. I'm sorry.
that's one of the
Oh,
atheist distortions of science.
it's.
well, let's no, no. Okay,
Mm,
so
I
so to
can't.
get back on topic,
I can't.
um, uh, to get back on topic. So and like I said, I think we could. This could be a marvelous discussion for us to have at some other point. But I'm
Well,
very
I think
interested
we
in your
have to give
story.
Courtney a chance to
I
recover. She seems
no.
very
It's
upset.
well. I think the reason that I'm in a state is that both you and I really want to correct misconceptions and to educate people about what is true and what isn't about science and about religion. And we are very much opposed to what we feel is damaging and what we feel is educational. And so I think it, it's it's difficult for me to not respond because I know it's not the topic and I know that we're wasting time, and so I can't. But it's it's difficult to have the
Okay.
opposing view
I
not represented. But
Well,
okay,
I think we hear lots of that other view, and we have lots of deconversion
we
stories.
do, we
And
do.
Dr. Cy Garte is a PhD in a scientific field, so I do give him a little more leeway in
Yeah,
saying what science is and isn't over
yeah,
such as myself, who does not have a PhD in a scientific field. So, and I'm aware that a lot of it's opinion, but it's still, I think, I appreciate his coming on to give us his views. So what
yes. And
were
I don't want to feel for you to feel like I'm being combative or attacking or anything. It's just it's
You're triggered.
well, no.
Okay.
I think the situation is triggering me. The situation of that. But anyway, go ahead.
so did you lose any friends as a result of this, or did you have what were the other sort of consequences? It sounds like you had uh, at first a very difficult time. You felt very isolated, and then you started to find others in your field who felt sort of very similar to you, and so after that you felt comfortable. You wrote a book about it. What were some of the? It sounds like I've heard some of the positive consequences that you hadn't been expecting. What were some of the negative consequences, do you think?
Very few, actually. I was relieved and surprised that I did have one negative comment from my immediate boss, not Collins, but the guy in between Collins and me. He was, when he found out I was going to, I had to get permission to go to a Christian conference from him, because in my position, I had to get permission to go anywhere for anything. So I had to get permission, and he was very surprised and was not terribly friendly after that. But that was minor. That was a minor issue. I didn't experience any kind of censure from anyone. But again, most people didn't know. But still, very few friends have dropped me as a result. One very close friend was very surprised, and she's an atheist, but she has expressed interest in understanding. You know, she bought my book, or I think I sent it to her actually, and she was very interested in it and wants to talk to me more about it. So I haven't had. I mean, I've heard stories of people who've said that you know, they were discriminated against, they didn't get tenure, they didn't get promotions, whatever. That I didn't experience any of that, and the only thing I could say is that a couple of times I've had papers turned back, not accepted, when there was some indication in the paper, not in the actual text, of course not, but in my affiliation, okay, that looked like it might be spiritually or religiously involved. But again, that's only a suspicion. So basically, it's very minor negative consequences, if any.
And we do have I think we have a super chat from Saka, who is asking for me to answer a question that he had asked and I'm going to have to go back because I think he tagged us in a question and I missed it. So, but oh, and of course I have either closed the window or just everything is moved around here. So I may have to. I'm going to need a minute for that. So, what inspired you to write a book about it? I think a lot of people go through this and they don't write a book about it, and they just sort of keep yeah. So that's interesting. So I was hoping you could tell us more about that.
So actually, what got me to write the book, and the reason the book was accepted by the publisher and by an agent before that, is that I didn't know this, but I found out that my story was unusual. That there are people who convert after experiences, but very few of them were actually raised the way I was, and very few are doctoral level scientists. There are some, but I was someone who always loved to write. This is my 5th book, actually. I've written other books on science before, and I have one other popular book, which was published in 2007, mass market book on the environment. So I consider myself a writer, and I had written many things related to my story and to science in general and science and faith. And so people said to me, you know, you should write a book about this. And you know, I know how hard it is to get a book published. I was somewhat reluctant, but I eventually did put it together as a book. And I thought, well, let me see if I can get an agent. You know what that's like, Nick. I don't have to tell you about the publishing world.
Yeah. Fun.
So I was very lucky. I got one of the best Christian agents in the business, and they were able to get it published by Kriegel. So, you know, it's done okay. It's not a bestseller, but it's done all right. It's sold, you know, a lot of copies to various people. I don't know if I've hit my target audience yet. Hopefully, they will eventually get to it. This pandemic has put a crimp on a lot of book sales, as you probably also know. Some sales are going up, but other sales are actually going down. So it's complicated. But anyway, I'm glad I wrote it. I'm now working on another book, which I don't want to talk about, but it's just at the early stages, and we'll see. So yeah.
So we do have a couple of questions, so let me try to hit those, and then I think we'll wrap it up. From Sokka Count, $5. Thank you, Sokka. He wanted me to ask, it's science that led you to believing in God, but your belief in Christianity wasn't scientific. How do you square that circle? How is theism justified? Or did he mean how is it that your theism is justified, but your Christian views are not?
No, that's not quite accurate. I mean, I don't think I said that. Uh, uh, okay, so first of all, science didn't actually lead me to God, because I don't think science addresses God. Science led me to agnosticism, because I could no longer believe in the materialism that I had originally associated with atheism. Now, that may have been unfair to atheism, as Courtney said, but that's how I associated it. So I began exploring the issues of spirituality and alternative ways of thinking. And that eventually led me to a theistic view, which was not very strongly held, but I still thought, well, maybe God is real. Christianity did not come from science, but it's not opposed to science. There's nothing in science that prevents belief in Christianity, in my view. So what I said was that it was personal experiences, from attending church to reading the Bible to having direct experiences with God, that led me to Christianity. And you can say that that's not scientific, and I will say, yes, it's not scientific. That doesn't mean it's not true.
All right, and then I think I had another one, but I have lost track of it. I apologize. The live chat's been going, which is good to see. But all right, well, I think that's just about going to cover it now.
All right.
So thank you very much for coming on to tell us your conversion story. Your book is not linked at the bottom. I apologize. We connected, like I said earlier, to the Dillahunty stream by accident. That was there, and I just put the wrong key in, connected straight to that. That's where everybody
Nick, everybody confuses me with Matt Dillahunty.
the similarities are just yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that was the first thing I was going to say when this stream started. I was like, "Are we on the atheist experience?" Because it really feels that way. So
I certainly made it feel that way. I'm sorry. I really did.
Well, listen. It's very hard to look at him. Look at that smug look on his face. Like, it's just like I every time he comes on, I just want to, yeah.
Wait a minute.
Oh God! Oh, here we go. Yeah. Well, he's. So now, if we could only turn that into like a gag and just keep. I mean, deeply respect you. Thank you for coming on. So, in all seriousness, thank you for coming on. We've got actually our Patreon hangout is coming up on Monday, and I think we're actually going to move that back. And I'm glad I remember that. We're going to move the Patreon hangout back, I think, to 9:00. That's normally the time we've been doing the stories from lockdown, but since most of this country is not locked down, I unfortunately have a feeling we're going to be doing those again in not too. I mean, there are people going to water parks. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of the water parks, but
yeah, I think we could have a conversation about the lack of lockdown, because that's just emotionally taxing in and of itself.
Well, what everybody's doing now is everybody is on the rebound. This is what happened in China, which is now people want to be out more than ever, and they've been. And I go for a walk every morning, and it used to be I was the only one doing it, and I had the mask. I did the whole 9 yards, even though I'm the only one out there. Now I'm bumping into people left. Everybody's out. I've never seen anything. I've never seen this many people outside. So I think unfortunately we're headed for a problem, and we'll be inviting you back to discuss that when the numbers head south again, which unfortunately I think they will. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for the super chat, Sokka. Thank you, everybody in the live chat. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Dr. Garte. And I look forward to seeing, like I said, Patreon hangout. If you're not a patron, I hope you will consider becoming one. We have on many levels. It's the link is in the description. You get to meet Courtney and I. Most people, I say Courtney and I, they hear Courtney, what? And Nick, oh, well, clicking that link suddenly becomes way too hard. But, I hope you'll consider it. Patreon Hangout will be coming up, I think, on this Monday. It's the first Monday of every month. And then we do have a number of guests. We also are doing, with ProLib tonight, we will be doing an update on the breaking news out of China, or actually out of the U.S., which is that we will no longer be recognizing Hong Kong as independent, and that recognition is actually a formal one and is really a body blow to the state of Hong Kong and any kind of independence from China. So we will be discussing that. ProLib will be on with us to discuss that, and we look forward to seeing you all later.
And coming up, we also have Richard Carrier, and we'll be talking about a similar topic to this, which is the relationship between religion and science, according to Richard Carrier as well. So he's done some studies on that as well. And
how did I forget that? Don't tell him. Nobody tell him. I forgot that. Yes, Dr. Carrier will be coming on to discuss the influence of science. Early Christianity and early science. So we'll look forward to having him on for that. Thank you. Don't tell him. Please don't. Nobody needs to know. See you all later.